Yeah, I mean, that's a...
So for this lesson, I will be addressing survival signals and symbols recognized by the international community and how to use them in a case of emergency. The standard that will be addressed is that of wilderness safety, and the objective today will be for each of you to observe, remember, and associate 6 survival signals and their corresponding symbols. Before we move further into this lesson, I would like each of you to participate in the class Kahoot so that I can assess your prior knowledge on the subject. If you would want it, you can either access it using the access code that will come up when I log on to the URL, or you can access it through the slide. Access code is up on the screen. This is just to assess your background knowledge and to see how much you know about wilderness signals before we actually get into the lesson. Everyone on here, or
Chloe's still logging in. Ooh, they do have fancy pictures.
that is correct.
Yes.
SOS is the main universal signal that will be recognized by individuals on any continent and by any rescue agency. The other signals that we will be learning are recognized by the large majority, but there are some countries that do not recognize them. And when you're in doubt, if you're in doubt, you should use this signal. Can everyone see them?
Mm-hmm.
Correct. You can use pieces of cloth as an emergency signal, but they should be 10 feet or longer, not less than 10 feet, and they also should be multicolored. They should not be a single color in order to attract attention. That is false. Although in most cases, you should use a flare as a supplementary signal, but if you have any material that you can use to form various other signals, then you should use them. That the flare should only be an addition or a last resort.
Because you can only use it once, is that why?
Yes,
Okay.
and it's not as visible as
Where's the
a
other
10-foot cloth.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Oh. I guessed.
It's it's 1 hour walking distance. There was no specification for why that was the case, but that's the general rule. That's the general rule for it being in a wilderness emergency, is if you can't get to any civilization within an hour of walking. Good. Now let's move on to the rest of the lesson. So in this lesson, there will be 6 main discussion questions that will be addressed. These can be found on the slide up front, and they can be found on the Google slide that's been sent to you. You don't have to write these down, but I would recommend that you spend a moment or so looking over them to make sure that you familiarize yourself with them while we go through the lesson. The corresponding Bloom's taxonomy levels are written along the left side of the screen. Does everyone have some time to look over them? Okay. So the first group of signals that we will be addressing is that of medically related symbols. The 3 main symbols that fall into this category are, which represents requiring a doctor or in a serious medical emergency. Which means requiring medical supplies. And which means unable to proceed. Overall, looking at these symbols, it may be difficult to initially see how the definitions for them relate to each other, but after you observe it for a little while, it's actually quite simple. First off, when you think of a doctor, you usually think of one individual, and you wouldn't think of multiple individuals. So therefore, when associating it with one of these symbols, it'd be easy to think of the Roman numeral 1 for representing a doctor or representing someone who could treat a serious medical emergency. From this point, another main trick that could be used to remember that Roman numeral 2 is related to medical supplies is that this would be kind of associated with the more pluralistic version of medicine. Instead of just being a doctor, you think of medical supplies as a group of different items, and therefore you would assume that therefore you could associate that with the Roman numeral 2. Finally, from this point, X may be difficult to understand in this context, as unable to proceed isn't directly a medical term, but you could associate that with death or serious injury, and X is often associated with those type of circumstances, so you could use that as a way to remember that. Just go over these for a second before we move on to the next group of terms. From this point, the second main group of wilderness emergency signals that we're going to go over in this context are those of airplanes and navigation. The 4 main symbols that are going to be addressed in this context are which means ready for flight or will attempt takeoff. Which means prepared for landing. Which means aircraft seriously damaged. And finally, which means proceed in that direction. In order to remember these terms, group these symbols and their associated signals, a good way of thinking about them is to think of the straight line as representing the ground and the rotated V-shaped item as representing the aircraft. In this way, you could assume that the triangle with the bottom separated from it could represent takeoff or ready for flight. You could assume that the full triangle is represented prepare for landing, because it would make it appear as if the aircraft was on the ground. You could assume that the rotated L's could be associated with aircraft seriously damaged, because you could associate that with the aircraft broken or cut in half, and the triangle cut in half looks kind of like two L's. And then for this symbol, for proceeding that direction, you could assume that it would represent that meaning, because this would represent the aircraft, and then it kind of looks like an arrow. Does that make sense? So go over these for a few moments, and then we'll move on to group 3 of wilderness emergency signals.
Lee, what are the three
The
on the
links.
right? What are
Those are links for English language learners. They're the links off to the side represent each symbol has a slide. There's an image to go along with it, and then it's represented in either Spanish, Mandarin, or Arabic.
Wow.
From this point, the next group of signals and symbols that we will go over are those signals that relate to words, that relate to the word definitions of these symbols, and either their first letters or their ending letters. The first group that we will address under group 3 is that of the letters that the definition words start with. The first, in this group, the main symbols are or yes, or no, or mechanic, and food. Because these are generally fairly easy to remember because of the associations with the beginning letters, I'm going to move on to the next section, but you should make sure to write all these down in your notes to make sure that you know them for the next activity.
How is W represented by mechanic?
Because I meant for it to look like I was flipping the M over using this. So because M is the first letter for mechanic, and then if you flip it over, it looks like a W. So that's what I meant for implications for that. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Well, because my computer's not wanting to cooperate right now, we're gonna continue on using the whiteboard. Oh, yes, good,
Go get PowerPoint.
yes. Are you okay with? So the second part, the second group that we will be, the second part of group 3 that we will be using, or that we will be addressing, are those that related to the ending letters or letters that could be, or letters that are associated with words in the definition. So in this group, the four main signals that will be addressed are, which means oil or fuel, L, which would mean well, which means I'm not able to understand well, not able to understand well, and finally, which means indicate, to proceed, so that I can know where to go. The group of words in the box is what's meant to represent the symbols for those that are multi-word answers, and I'll give you a moment to write these down because the PowerPoint's not cooperating at this time, and because these are slightly more difficult to remember than the other section of part 3.
What was the first one?
Fuel.
Oil or fuel.
So in what situation would the letter symbols be used?
The letter symbols would be used. Well would be used if you're stranded but you're not in any immediate danger. Oil or fuel would be if your plane or if another vehicle that you have is working fine, but you need more material to make it run. And then not able to understand. They didn't really elaborate on that much, but I would assume that would be if you're in conversation with another group of individuals who are trying to rescue you, and you still need to communicate in some way using some of the materials that we discussed earlier. And then for indicate which direction to proceed, that would just be what direction that you need to go in order to reach civilization if you're not within the hour's distance. Does that make sense? What? Let me just get rid of these real quickly, and then we'll move on to the final section of symbols that we will discuss before we move on to the interactive activity. Okay, the fourth group of symbols that we are going to discuss are mostly miscellaneous symbols, but they could apply to stuff that you may bring on a camping trip or stuff that you may have brought in the condition knowing that you would be in the wilderness for a while. So in this group, the three main symbols that we will be discussing are which means firearm or require firearm and ammunition. Which means require mount and compass. And finally, which means require signal lamp and radio. These can kind of be associated with the shape of some of these items, but these are probably some of the more difficult symbols to have to remember. So in order to remember them, you probably need to go over these the most.
What was the last one?
This is require signal lamp or radio with battery. Does everyone have each one written down? Okay. So for the next section of the activity, it's going to be an outdoors activity, and what we'll be doing is, I would like you as a group to come up with at least one signal that you would want me to represent the corresponding symbol with. I'm going to be using these multicolored strips of cloth in order to represent it. After I represent it, I want each of you, if I've represented it correctly, to move your arm like this to designate that I've done it correctly. The reason why I'm wanting you to use this motion is because that is what pilots or other rescue individuals are supposed to do with their vehicle's wings if they understand the signal. If I do not represent your signal correctly, I do not want you to do that. I may try to trick you with this. So we are going to go outside over there, outside this window, and this shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes. Make sure to take your notes with you.